Welcome to our video on rule sets. Here we're going to talk all about the different types of rule sets and some of the different ways that they can be used in decisions, as well as look at some use cases to help give you an idea of how rule sets may be useful for you. So first of all, if you're not familiar with rule sets, well, what are they? Well, a rule set is a combination of rules, flows, it could be any combination of them, not just simply all rules or all flows or all truth tables, any combination of rules and flows that run on the same object or the same pieces of data with the same inputs and outputs. This can be very useful if you're trying to keep organized, if you have lots of rules and things that need to be run over the same type of objects. So it can be very interesting and useful topic to use in decisions. So you might be asking, well, why do I want rule sets? Why might I want to use a rule set versus using rules? And there's a couple things that you'll have to consider and think about. So first, we'll talk about how rules could be designed if you want to run a number of them in a flow. And there's really two kind of schools of thought or ways that you could do this. One of them is by simply just placing a bunch of rules in a flow. And you can see here, this is really the simplest way, but it creates this messy web of lines and pathways, the true or false paths coming out of the rules. It can definitely be difficult to manage and track and look at. So it can become very ugly very fast, especially if you have lots of rules. A little bit more technical way of running a lot of rules in the way that they would probably have been run before rule sets were added to decisions is you would have a folder. That folder will be full of all of the rules that you want to run. And then in your flow, you would be able to take that folder, fetch all the rules that are inside that folder, loop through them, and then use runtime selection to then run every single rule and then, do whatever you need to do with the data from it. So there's a couple ways that it could be done, but either way, both of these are tedious, could be tedious in some ways. Also, the design of them might not look as pretty, especially that first way. The second way still requires a few steps with a fetch, a loop, a runtime selection, and then whatever you're doing with the data to build that data up. It could be a little bit ugly. With rule sets, really you're only going to have one or two steps in the flow that are required in order to have these rule sets running properly, in addition to anything extra, that you want to run in addition to that. But it's going to look a lot nicer and has the same exact capabilities as the rules examples that I gave. Another thing that could be useful and something to take note of is the difference in how inputs can get set up. When you're setting up individual rules, if you're creating a bunch of different rules, you're going to have to set the input data on those rules every single time. Now, you could use a design pattern if you're familiar with design patterns. You could use a design pattern so you don't have to reset those rules every single time. You can set the design pattern once and use that. But if you're not familiar with that, then it becomes very tedious to have to set up your input data on every single rule every single time you set it up. And if you've got 50 rules, that's obviously not really a good option. Rule sets, on the other hand, have one place where you set the inputs, and then all rules on that rule set will utilize those inputs, those provided inputs. Another place that's going to be different between the two is where outputs are set and how output data is output from rules. So if you set up a normal rule, your data is just simply going to output whatever that data is. If it's just a simple true or false, it's going to tell you whether it's true or false. That's it. If it's expecting it to output some kind of data, which you can set on a rule, it will output that data, and that's it. Rule sets, on the other hand, output a different data type called flow rule set result. This outputs, first of all of that data, the same exact information, the true or false value if it's a Boolean, the specific data if you're outputting data from your rules. But in addition to that, a lot of other interesting metadata or useful data. The name of the rule that got run, execution time and how long it took to run, potential exception details if the rule had an exception, even whether or not the rule was run. Sometimes a rule might not even run for various reasons, but it can still track the data on that rule to even point out that it didn't even run, things like that. And so this could become useful. Maybe it's not, but maybe it is useful in reporting and tracking data of your rules that you can't quite easily get from just using a simple rule or regular rules in a process. Now, something that's going to be important is to talk about the three types of rule sets. Because we're not just running it in one way, there's three different ways that you could have rule sets run. And we're going to take a deeper dive into each of them. The first type of rule set is instances. Instance is just a set of rules. They run on the same object. It's going to run all those rules. Then we have a template with instances. A template with instances has a set of default rules. So everything that runs through will run those default rules. Then it'll also be told one specific subset of rules. And so then in addition to all the default rules, it'll run that specific subset. Conditionals, very similar, but a conditional will have your default rules, and then your subsets will have a condition tied to them. And so if the condition runs true, or if that condition matches, then it'll run the subset that's underneath that condition. So it could run multiple conditions to check those and run all the additional subsets underneath each of those conditions if those conditions meet the correct criteria. So we're going to take a deeper dive into each of these and look at some examples of them. So we'll start with the very simple one, the instances. So instances, nice and simple, are just going to run all of the rules provided in that rule set. A couple things that we can do, so there's a little bit more configuration. You can very easily enable or disable the rules. That's what the green little toggles are on the side over here that allow you to just turn off rules if you want to turn them off temporarily. You can easily do that. You can also adjust the order of the rules. So if you have a use case where the order matters, you can easily change that order. If you want certain rules to run first, then you can do that. An example of rule sets with instances is in our financial lending project. If you have a use case where you just simply have a bunch of rules that you want to run, no really association or reason why certain ones might not run, you just want to run all of them, you could do that. In our financial lending project, for example, one of our training projects, we have 4 truth tables that regardless of whose data is running through this financial lending loan application process, all of them are going to run these 4 truth tables regardless. And so we have this process to then run all 4 of them, output the data of those to calculate a score, and then go through the rest of the process, right? You can see it here. I've got 3 that got collapsed, and then here's the 4th one. It outputs the data, it outputs all the metadata that I mentioned before, but all of the values are always running every single time, no matter what. That's where instances can be useful if you just no discrimination running all of your rules. Now, template with instances gets a little bit more complicated because there's more to build inside it. First, we have your default rules. So when you create your template with instances, you can set a number of default rules set to always run. Then you go ahead and create individual instances that can each have their own sets of rules. So in our example here, we've got our default rules all sitting inside the testing template rule set section, and then 2 instances created, number 1 and number 2. And each of those instances can have their own set of rules underneath them. If information comes in, it'll read some value, and that value will tell it to run number 1 or number 2 for the specific additional instances. Something else that's important to note that applies for these rule sets is that each instance with a template with instances is a new folder. It's pretty clear with the images here, it does make the folder there to show that that's the case, but they are folders that are housing different rules. So your root folder in a rule set is the main folder. Anything inside that root folder is going to have your default rules. And then you have your instances, which are the subfolders underneath that. Those instances will also house their own sets of rules. So then when the process runs, it'll run all of the rules in your default root folder, in addition to whichever one of the instances is chosen to run in your process. So here's an example to talk about to help hopefully explain this concept and how it works a little bit. So let's say we have taxes, and in the United States, there's a couple different ways that you could have taxes based on the state and across all states. So your federal taxes are your taxes that apply everywhere. Every single person in every single state have these specific tax rules related to them. Then there's individual state taxes that change depending on the state that someone lives in. So what would happen in this rule set is the rule set will be told what state the person lives in. And so now the rule set knows what state they're in. It would run all of the federal tax rules that apply to everybody. Then it will also run the rules of the state that that person lives in. So let's say someone lives in Virginia. This rule set will be told, hey, this person lives in Virginia. I'm going to now run all of the federal tax rules then I'm going to run all the Virginia tax rules and then output the data accordingly. If someone's from Ohio, it'll run all of the federal tax rules, then it'll run all of the Ohio tax rules, and so on and so forth. Another great example of this is in one of our other training projects called the Insurance Claim Project. In this project, data comes in through a JSON with various pieces of insurance claim information, but one of those aspects that's important is there is a rule set or a rule set with instances with detailed whether they're client A, B, or C. And depending on which client they are, it'll run a second set of rules in addition to the defaults. And then this rule set will help route those outputs and display any information why this person may have an invalid insurance claim. So you have the data, comes in with JSON. It comes out through client A, client B, or client C with the specific client ID in addition to whatever the other data is. And then in our process, we actually have a truth table. That truth table will read that client ID. And depending on which client it is, it'll output the ID of the folder that is associated with that particular instance. So for example, if it's client A, it's going to read client A, it's going to output this ID. Now this ID is the ID of this client A folder. So it does output that data directly to tell me, okay, I need you to run the client A rules in addition to the default rules. If it's client B, here's the ID. That ID applies to the client B folder, so it can run those rules. If it doesn't match any of them, it provides a separate string just to point out that none of those clients match whatever client was listed in the original piece of information. Something that's important to note with a rule set, if you are using a template with instances and you do not pass that ID from like the IDs that we put in that truth table, it will cause it to error out. So you do need to make sure that those IDs are going through, and you may have to consider the option of what if my process didn't get the correct ID. In our case for this project, we have a rule that checks to see if it output that last string that there was no ID, and it routes it away from the rule set so we don't have that error happen. And then if it does have the rule set, a template with instances will have a special input in addition to whatever inputs are expected on the rule set for that rule set ID. So you'll just need to make sure that you tell it which rule set to run or which specific instance to run based on that information, which is what that truth table is giving us. Another thing that's important to note and could be very useful is there is a setting on template with instances only called edit parameters. Edit parameters gives you the ability to disable specific default rules for just that instance. So if you have a case where you have all these default rules, but maybe one instance that you don't want to run that specific default rule, you can disable that for that instance only. For example, with that tax example, let's say you've got 49 states that all follow the same rule for a tax, but there's one state that does not have to follow that rule for whatever reason, based on its state laws or whatever that may be. So instead of having to go into each of those 49 states and individually add that rule for each of those 49 states, you may say, I want to put that rule as a default rule, and then just edit the parameters on the one single state that it doesn't apply to and disable that default rule for the one state. And that this edit parameters option allows you to do that. So you can configure things depending on how you want your design to look. It may be a little bit easier to do that process. But this brings up an interesting thought of, well, how else could I consider enabling and disabling rules in a process to be more dynamic or more configurable? Because it may give us more power for different users to adjust and change how data works in my process. So a couple things is first, as I pointed out before, the rule set designer itself allows you to easily just enable and disable rules through the toggles on the side. So designer users easily have the access to just enable and disable things as needed if they'd like. In addition to that, you have the ability to have a dashboard with a report that could display all of your rules. Using the element registration table, you can choose whether or not those rules are enabled or disabled. There's a field on the element registration table called enabled, and you could, if you wanted to, set up user actions on a dashboard that can then give end users control to click on that user action and disable a specific rule. So you could change that enabled field in the element registration table to be false. And so now that rule will be disabled. It just gives you more power to give to users or to give people that have the correct permissions to change and adjust that data without having to go in and redesign rules or design new rules or change different things. If you have some process that you want to give people the option to have more configurability. And it can also require approval or anything like that within these actions and these flows. So it's not just, you're not giving someone too much power, but it does give you a lot of great leverage in your process to do those kinds of things. The last rule set is a conditional rule set. So conditional rule sets are very similar to template with instances. There's a set of default rules that are set to always run, but then underneath those default rules, you can set conditions. Now, they look like this in the bottom with a little gray box around it called control rule. In versions older than 9, it would put brackets around the title and call it set control to let you know that it is the set control rule. But overall, what this does is it'll set the control value of some rule so that you can say, okay, if this control rule is true, then I want to run all the rules underneath it. If that control rule is not true, then I don't need to run any of these rules. Another thing that also you have the power to do with conditional rule sets is you can nest conditions inside conditions. So not only can you have a bunch of rules underneath a condition, but you can have a separate condition that can run nested underneath other conditions. Something that you aren't able to do in template with instances, for example. If we look at a quick example of this to kind of help set the stage and understand how this might work, let's say we have a group of employees for an organization, and we want a bunch of rules to assess information about those employees. So you'll still be able to set default rules that apply to all employees. But then after that rule runs, you may say, okay, now that I've checked all the main rules that I want to check, I want to check a couple important aspects of this employee to see if there's additional rules I need to run. So maybe I need to check if that employee's in the training department, I want to check another subset of rules. If they are, I'm going to check those rules and then move on. If they're not in the training department, I'm going to skip those rules and then move on. Then say, okay, maybe I want to check their start date. And if they're a newer employee within the last couple of months, then I have another set of rules that I want to check. If they are, I'll check all those rules. If they're not, I'm going to skip all those rules. Go to the next one, check if they're a manager, and so on and so forth for all the different conditions that you could have in your process. The conditional rule set really allows you to have configurability and more options in saying, I want the ability to maybe run every single one of these rules, or I may even have the ability to run none of these rules, depending on if the conditions for these specific subsets are met or not. An example of this in a real use case is there's a process that has a list of forms that are required for some kind of insurance policy. So your process will take this list of required forms, send it to the rule set, and the rule set has conditions that check if that is one of the required forms. So it'll say, hey, if form A on this list of required forms, if it is, then I want to continue my process with all this extra logic that I have for form A. If form A is not required, then I'm going to move on. I'm going to check form B. And so then in some kind of policy case, maybe only form A is required. So then it's going to run that logic. And then maybe in the next policy, form A, C, D, and F are all required. So it's going to run each of those pieces of logic. Maybe on the next one, none of them are required. So it's not going to run any of that extra logic, right? But it does have the ability to run this separate logic depending on the use case. Now, another thing that's going to be important to talk about is the rule sets setup. So if you are in a rule set, setup is really easy to access. There's a gear right in the corner when you're inside your rule set that'll just open up the settings. You could also right click on your rule set and click setup rule set if you wanted to access the settings. But in here is just a number of settings that you can set and make adjustments for whatever your rule set is. And we'll talk about a couple of the important ones that stick out. This is where you need to go to set up your rule set type, so you can choose whether you're setting up a conditional or a template with instances and whatnot, as well as a number of other features. Some of them are pretty self-explanatory. If you want to show a path if all of the rules run true, or a separate path if they all run false. You can output error lists or false lists or anything like that. If you have additional things you want to output, you can easily do that. You can also set your inputs up inside this. In addition to setting your inputs up on the left side over here, you could easily set your inputs up in your process as well. So there's a lot of useful things to do in your settings here on the rule set. The main things that I wanted to point out are, first of all, you can set up types of rules that are allowed to run in your process. So by default, rule set will only allow you to set up evaluation rules, which are just statement rules, the if then types of rules. But you can easily add additional types of rules. If you want your process to run truth tables, if you want your process to have matrix rules, there's flows that you can have run in a process. So if you want your process to do a little bit more than just statement rules, you can easily check these. And you can freely go in and out, check and uncheck these if you want to add the options to add these rules in your rule sets. Easily, no problem. Another maybe interesting one that you could use is to choose whether or not your rule set will stop running at different points. So maybe you want to just run everything, or maybe you want it to stop at a certain aspect. Maybe you have a use case where as soon as it finds a false value in running through your process, that disqualifies the user from continuing on in your process. So if that's the case, then you may just want to stop and you don't need to check the rest of the rules. This may be also a use case where the order of your rules would matter in your rule set. You use instances, you have 20 rules in there, and then you set your order specifically because maybe rule number one is the rule that most people fail out of this rule set from. And so you just want that to get that one out of the way. So then the rest of the rules don't have to run if it fails. Stop on first, false, and then doesn't have to, run through the whole rest of the process. Different options that may be useful depending on the use case. Another thing also that's important to note is there's a stop processing on exception setting that you can set here as well. So if you remember all the data that can come out of a rule set, the data about an exception details is one of the possible outputs. If a error happens on a rule set within the rules, it'll just output with that error and then continue processing all the other rules. But if you don't want it to do all that and you want it to stop your process, you can actually have it set to do that. It's not on by default, but you can turn that option on if you want your rule set to stop if there's an error inside one of the rules. One other important setting to set up in your rule sets is to set the usage, which is essentially how data gets output from your rules in your rule set. So like we mentioned before, your inputs and outputs are going to be the same across all rules in a rule set. So you set it up once in the beginning of your process, and then all of your rules will have that same input or output. Now your output option is set based on this usage selection. There's three options here to choose from. First one is logical. This is simply just outputting the Boolean results, trues or falses. It's the most basic option. It may not be the most popular just because it's really simplistic, where it just outputs true or false, but it could be useful depending on the use case and what you're trying to do with your rule set. The next and probably more popular option is data return. Data return allows you to just select any data type of your choice to be the output. You could select decisions native types, either simple ones like strings and integers, the more complex ones like assignments and accounts, or you can create your own data type, and whatever you create can be the output. The policy example that I mentioned earlier had a return type of message to output some kind of policy changes or anything that was made through the rule set process. The insurance claim example that I had mentioned outputs data. So there's a string that details any errors that may have happened in that insurance claim or reasons why that insurance claim is invalid. So it outputs a string. So you can have data come out of it. The last one, and it's very niche, but is very interesting, is scoring. So you can actually set up a specific scoring strategy in your rule set if you want to add values, score values to any of your outputs. So how this one works is it'll output a decimal of data for every single rule that you place in it, and then you can set up a scoring strategy. There's a few common use case ones, things like adding everything up with a sum or finding the average of all of your scores or something like that, or you could set up your own custom one. In the financial lending project that I had mentioned earlier with those 4 truth tables, where we use instance to run all 4 of the truth tables, we use a custom scoring method. So then what we can do is we can take the data, whichever value gets output from those truth tables, it'll get multiplied by different values. And each of the truth tables is weighted differently. So the credit score truth table is worth the most at 40%. So we multiply that by that value and then put everything together to get a final score value that's used in that process. So scoring is definitely a very interesting way to output data in a set of rules as well. One final thing to talk about is rule auditing. So rule auditing is something that you can use to capture data from your rules that you can then use and report on all of your data to report on everything. Now this becomes very interesting because it allows you to really track everything that happened in all of the rules that runs in your system. In every single rule and decisions, not just rule sets, every single rule has the ability to audit the data of that rule. It's more popular in rule sets just because you tend to more often want to audit your rules and you're running a lot of them. And rule sets is the easiest way to run a lot of rules. But again, you can capture it on anything. So if you are in a flow designer, you have a rule, a truth table, a matrix rule, rule sets, whatever, you'll see the option to capture audit history or capture phrase audit history in the properties on that flow step. If you select any of these options, you'll have 3 new inputs that get added to the other inputs on that particular rule set. It'll include rule audit folder ID, some folder ID that you want to track your rule audit data in, the rule audit ID, a value that you can choose for yourself to just easily track what that rule audit information will be, and then a rule audit name, another value that you can use to track. Basically, all 3 of these are just ways that you can easily track the data for the rules that you want to run in your process. It's important to note that if you use audit history anywhere, all rules across the entire system write to the same database table. So if you have project A and that has a rule set that's tracking audit history, and project B has a different rule set that's tracking audit history, and then project C has a truth table that's tracking audit history, right? Regardless of the fact that these are all in different projects, they all write to the same table in the database. So this audit folder ID, the rule ID, and the rule audit name can be very important in helping track your data, especially when it's across different projects. So make sure that you keep that in mind if you're trying to audit your data. You don't want to get it mixed up and tracking everything across multiple systems. If you want your data to just look at one, you may not realize it, but it is not project specific by default. You will have to filter your reports using the rule audit information that you provide to make sure that your reports are only displaying the information that you want. Once you're ready to build your report, let's say you set your rule audit values, you've placed your information in, you've run your flows, so then a couple of rules have been running through your process, then you can report on it. You build your reports, and there's 2 data sources you could choose from depending on if you chose one or both of the checkboxes for rule audit history or rule phrase audit history. They do write to different tables technically, so there are 2 different data sources you could potentially choose from. So they will have a little bit of differences. They do share those 3 inputs that you set for yourself, as well as a couple other things like the rule name or the result data and things like that. That data is mostly shared between them, but there are a couple other ways that they do things. The rule audit history really contains just more information about the rules themselves and the execution of those rules, whereas the rule phrase audit history is a bit more of like the readable data and the phrasing that was utilized in those rules. So the phrase is a little bit more readable or user friendly in the details of what happened in the rule, as well as even the verbs that got run, whereas the rule audit history is more just the specific rules and data of the rules. That concludes our video over all of the different aspects of rule sets. Thank you for watching.